Morning and welcome to this episode of our Global Business Chat, where we're going to be focusing on the anatomy of a real estate transaction in Australia. I want to thank the Hudson Gateway Association of Realtors and our Global Business Council, and I want to thank NAR as well for helping us put this together. Before we begin, I'd like to do a shout out to Cindy Fouth from NAR. Cindy is the Director of Marketing and Global Marketing and Member Services for NAR, and she was kind enough to help us put us in contact with Ray Ellis, who's joining us right now as our panelist and our guest speaker for today. What is our Global Business Chat? Basically, we don't really want to focus on market trends, pricing, property developments. We're not looking to sell you properties today. What we want to do is to introduce you, the global real estate professional, to the anatomy of a real estate transaction. What are the nuts and bolts of the real estate transaction in Australia? And Ray Ellis is going to help us get through that. And Mr. Ellis is the chief executive of the First National Real Estate. It has over 400 offices, and they're the largest network of independent real estate agents in Australia and New Zealand. Mr. Ellis also sits on the board of the National Association of REALTORS, bilateral partner in Australia, which is the Real Estate Institute of Australia. So I'd like to thank Ray Ellis for joining us today. And without further ado, Mr. Ellis, I won't say anything else about you. Why don't you introduce yourself and give us a little bit of background about your experience and your work history in Australia?
Well, thank you for that, Tony. It's a pleasure to be here. And with our international borders still closed in Australia, it's wonderful to meet my United States friends again, albeit in an electronic environment, because I haven't been able to get there. Unfortunately, I cannot get to NAR San Diego because our borders are still closed. And even though this is an electronic medium, it's great to be back in America again. So myself, yes, thank you for that kind introduction. Real estate in Australia is dominated by four major groups, and we're the second or the third biggest one, depending on what criteria you look at. And as in America, the market has been very hot here. Myself, I've been the chief executive for 15 years here now. Before that, I was a chief executive of a gaming and transportation group in Las Vegas, Nevada. And before that, I was the chief executive for Asia Pacific for the largest travel corporation in the world. And before that, I ran my own business, which was a big advertising agency. So it's taken me to many places throughout the world, including China and Japan, which are very important to our economy, run businesses there. But the most exciting part of my career has been working in real estate, and the friends and colleagues I've met and made around the world highlight what a great industry this is. Because what I like to say here in Australia, when you're in real estate, you help people with their dreams, ambitions, investments of the biggest opportunity in their life of how they create their wealth. And nothing can be truer than that in Australia. So I've had a broad experience, and that experience is generally about how to help people in real estate get their dreams and their passion, their investments. That's what we do, and that's what we do around the world throughout the NAR environment as well.
Great, thank you. And with our Global Business Council, our mission statement is to give our members the tools and resources that they need to connect globally. So this is what we're doing here today, and thank you for helping us achieve that goal. So I'd like to start with the first step. Right, we have a client, the United States, probably a second or third largest real estate investor in Australia over the past 2 or 3 years. You probably have better statistics than I do. So what do we need to know as real estate professionals in the United States when we want to introduce our clients to the Australian real estate market? What is the first step that we need to take? Can we just get on realtor.com or Zillow and just start looking for properties? Do we have a centralized database of properties in Australia if we want to just start doing a basic property search?
Yeah, well, I need to start with the most obvious one. Of course, the best place to find properties in Australia is at www.firstnational.com.au. I have to give a plug for my own organisation, but our country has two major real estate portals. One is called realestate.com and the other one is domain.com. they're our two biggest players in Australia, New Zealand, and the South Pacific. And you'll find every listing in Australia and New Zealand as well on those sites. That'll give you an indication of the properties. And the same as your portals, you're able to find out everything like that. You're able to do there, all those sorts of things. And the combat between them and us as agencies is the same debate as you have in America there, or whatever. Who's the friend or foe in that environment? But that's another debate. But to find the properties, that's where it is. And I need to give a big shout out to Cindy of the NAR environment, who is our liaison officer. And she's quite active in making sure the relationship between Australia and NAR is very strong, particularly in the United States. Does a tremendous job. And I myself would get between 1 to 15 emails a week from any realtor around America saying, you're the contact I found through our global network of, we want to do this, or those sorts of things. On 30% of occasions, I'm able to put in contact with a first national agent, depending on the town, location, size, environment, or else I'm able to refer them on to another organization to do it. And we get the similar thing from other parts of the world. So in finding a realtor in Australia, just the environment, it's a little bit different. For those people who don't know, we do not have a listing agent and a selling agent. In the Australian environment, it is the same person. The person who lists the property also sells the property. So you're only dealing with one person if you come across them. And then the referral fee, the splitting of the commission, the database of keeping control of the contact is the relationship you have with that realtor down here. I mean, again, through the good work Cindy does, we have a lot of accreditation, which goes back to the NAR accreditation. The word realtor is used for people who work in the international environment, and that's growing as a source of information. But we refer to ourselves as a real estate agent, and that real estate agent does everything involved in the selling and the listing of that property. So once you come in contact with that person, and generally the context of being a independent, part-time listing or selling realtor doesn't really exist here in Australia. A good size agency in a big suburb, in a big metropolitan city would consist of no more than, say, 10 to 15 agents. So that there's not a part-time relationship where you have 500 or 1,000 agents associated with one organization or whatever. That concept does not exist here in Australia. So it's very important to get into contact with the right realtor / real estate agent and building a relationship with them, particularly if they're used to dealing with the dynamics of an international inquiry. That's where the process begins first.
And in Australia, the agents are licensed, correct? We don't have to worry about dealing with someone who's not licensed. Chances are, if you're dealing in real estate, you're licensed to do that.
There's been a trend in recent times, particularly of the substantial, China is a big investor in real estate around the world. And because of our proximity, they're our #1 trading partner. The United States is our #2, New Zealand #3. Because of their proximity, there's lots of Chinese investment in Australia. That brings the Chinese and their economy, and I've actually lived and worked in China, that they like to control every part of the distribution chain. They call it their road and belt strategy at the official level from the Chinese government, and they like to build their road and belts around the world. And so there's been lots of influx of well-meaning mainland China-based agencies that have outshoots here in Australia. That closed circle is sometimes not as efficient we'd like it from a regulation point of view. That's an ongoing battle. But yes, the only difference is we have no federal licensing arrangements. That's not a criticism or a reason to be concerned. We only have 6 states. People who know Australia well, Australia landmass is basically the size of the United States. It's just that our population is only 25 million, and 96% of the Australian population live within 100 kilometres of the ocean, which means we have a great big country largely unoccupied in the middle of our country. 2/3 of that's desert. That's another story. So it's a small population base compared to the United States, but those 6 states have different regulations for licensing, of which 97% is the same in every state. But like in your states, Texas is always different than Connecticut, and so on, all those sorts of things. So there are just a few nuances around there, but it's very hard to operate. In fact, it's almost impossible to operate unless you are licensed by those state authorities, yes.
Okay. And I'd like to start by talking a little bit about, what are the restrictions for a foreign national in buying in Australia? If you're a non-resident, if you're buying property that's already developed, for example, someone's living in it, it's an established property. What are some of the things that we need to know as foreign investors in Australia? What are our limitations?
Well, the good news is that Australia, with our small population base, raising capital, raising wealth, raising investments, makes us depend upon international capital. That's at the macro level for our economy, and that filters down to our real estate market as well. So on the surface, particularly from a country like the United States, there's virtually no limitations on buying or having rental properties here in Australia. There's some limitations depending on what country you come from, but that's more about where that capital comes from to buy it, but that doesn't apply to the United States. There's no restrictions on bringing capital into Australia. There's no restrictions on buying property where if you're using finance as a loan to buy that property, that finance is back in the United States. The finance does not have to be here in Australia. Traditionally, the Australian dollar is always to the value of somewhere between 17.85 cents to the US dollar. So that makes it an ideal. So $1 million Australian is 750,000 American to buy $1 million property here. So that's always good. That's a traditional way. Every 10 to 12 years, our dollar gets to parity. Back in 2003, 2004, it was about $1.10, which was great for us. We could finally go to America and buy more with our dollar. But the dollar is always a big issue, but it's always most of the time the advantage of people from the United States. The only other restrictions are you have to comply, obviously, with all regulations here of owning a property, land taxes, property taxes, and all those sorts of things. And I'll come back to those in a minute. The only other one is that depending on the size of the property, and I'll start around, say, $500,000, that has I forget the full name off the top of my head because it is 1:30 a.m. on Wednesday morning here, so I may look bright and awake, but for all the listeners, you are speaking to Buck Rogers in the future because it's Wednesday morning. So I can't give you the lottery numbers from last night in America, but I can give them here in Australia. But a $500,000 property, you might pay $5,000 to $6,000 of foreign investment tax, and that goes up accordingly. But if you're buying a property, the taxes here in Melbourne, if you're buying $1 million property, the taxes are about $75,000, $80,000, and that's probably the second highest in our country. Sydney's a little bit higher. So the normal sort of association of taxes doing it. There's no, the great debate in our country is we know having lived in the States, I know about housing association charges, all those sorts of things. Gated communities are very rare in Australia. You buy an individual property. So if you bought $1 million property in Melbourne, Australia here, your ongoing taxes of rates and local taxes would be somewhere between $5,000 and $6,000 a year for, say, $1 million property. So about $80,000 to get into it, $5,000 or $6,000 there. We do have a capital gains tax here in Australia. For Australian residents, if it is your home of abode where you live, there is no capital gains tax applicable. For foreign investors, there is a capital gains tax applicable on that. So if you sold your $1 million property, the capital gains tax on that would be sort of $20,000 to $30,000, depending upon how much you paid as a tax coming in. That's less, but in reality, I don't want to say that's insignificant amount of money, but in relation to the investment and the growth you're gaining out of Australia, it's an insignificant amount of money.
So the tax consequence sounds fairly similar to what they might be in the United States. I have a number of clients from Australia who have purchased single-family homes here, for example, homes that might have been built, 80, 90, 100 years ago, and they rent them out. Are there any restrictions on what, let's say, an American can purchase in Australia? Are we limited to buying, let's say, new developments as opposed to a house that might already have been built 50 years ago and has a tenant in it?
There is no limitations. It's what I said. The Australian government is very conscious of, without an influx of overseas capital, our economy wouldn't survive. So it makes us one of the most friendly countries to own property. And it's a concept that people in the United States would be very familiar with. There's only 23 countries in the world that have security of tenure, and which means, I'm speaking to the converted here, that we have governments that in very, 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 very limited circumstances can come and repossess your property. They can to build a freeway, they can to build a new railway line, and our two countries are similar in that. But regardless of those circumstances, if you buy the property, your tenure, once you meet your mortgage requirements, all those sorts of things, if you own it outright, is safe, all those sorts of things. And in our region, there's only a small number of countries that have that. Us, Singapore, New Zealand, Japan, it used to be Hong Kong, different environments there now. And that security of tenure gives great comfort to Americans buying down here. And it gives great comfort to our biggest investor at the moment, China, because they want to, I need to be careful here. They want to put some of their capital in an environment outside their own country, so their great grandson or granddaughter can own that property at some stage. So security of tenure is something that exists in America, and you get the same security of tenure down here, apart from those small examples I spoke about. But otherwise, out there is no restrictions.
There is one thing that is unique to Australia that we don't have here in the United States. You have something called the Foreign Investment Review Board, and I think that's something that's very important for any international investor to know about, right? Because before we can actually go into the transaction itself and go into contract, well, we can go into contract in Australia, right? You need to go into contract before you can go to the Foreign Investment Review Board. But tell us a little bit about what that is, where that, why we need to apply to the Foreign Investment Review Board before we can move forward with a real estate transaction.
I actually sat on that board a number of years ago, mainly to do with transactions coming from China. But the main purpose of it, I don't want to say it's a rubber stamp. That'd be unkind to people like me who used to sit on it. But for the average American buying an average property in Australia, of a portfolio of one property, 2, 3, 10 or whatever over a period of time, you'll be granted approval from that. Unless you're bringing your money in from dubious circumstances, which is very hard for us to prove. But if you suddenly, and the issue here in Australia was that all of a sudden a young person from a country like China at 25 years of age was turning up to buy properties with a cash portfolio of $22 million. Well, I know at that age they may be accumulating that amount of wealth, but where does it come from? All those sorts of things. So that's the main issue of, I'm not going to use the phrase in a strict term, money laundering, but that's what the Foreign Investment Review for. But the average American is building a portfolio that doesn't hold up the process at all.
Okay, and this is it. So we need to make an application, to basically get our transaction approved. So we have to be in contract already, right?
Correct. Yes. Sir.
Correct. And then what is the timeline for that review? How long does it take before we can then proceed with the transaction? And what if we don't? What if we don't get this approval? What if we just go into the transaction and close?
Yeah. The transaction can close. It's not dependent upon the application to close the contract. But it is dependent on whether you can continue to hold that. So it doesn't hold up the process of the contract. And from a time frame in Australia, well, at the moment, if one of my agents lists the property today and it's Wednesday morning, there's a 96% chance that'll be sold by Saturday. But in a normal environment, once the property is listed in Australia in a normal market, that would take between 20 to 40 days to sell. And then the contract transaction to close the contract. Each state has its own legislation, but around Australia, that is generally 30, anything past 120 days is very, very abnormal. So it depends on the same as in your country, the desire of the seller / vendor to move on, and the financial applications of the purchaser to get that approved, all those sorts of things. So we have normal contracts subject to finance or whatever. But if you bought a property today, whatever date it is, the 12th, 13th of October, made the application the next week, and it was a 60-day transaction to close the contract, I'm going to say in 9 out of 10 cases, you'll have that approval of Foreign Investment Review Board, particularly if you're coming from America.
Right. And are you recommending have you seen circumstances where a foreign investor will put a deposit, an earnest deposit, when going into contract, and then having that approval denied from FIRB? Is there provision in the contract that you recommend that we place so that, for example, that it's subject, the contract, the transaction is subject to approval from the Foreign Investment Review Board?
Yeah, I mean, that becomes an annexure to the contract, because obviously, if we're doing 100 transactions this month, there may only be 1 or 2 where a foreigner is buying that property. That just goes to annexure on it, and that becomes part of the process. That's not a hindrance to it at all, no.
Okay, and there is a fee, right, that is associated with the application filing that foreign investors should be familiar with, or no?
I'd love to say I have it here, so please don't quote me on this, but the fee might be $800 or $1,000 or something like that. Again, on the size of the property, it's a small fee.
Okay, and let's say we've identified a real estate agent, we've identified a property, we're ready to make an offer. Who are the parties that we need to bring to the table? Here, the first thing I'm going to do is call an attorney. That's the first thing I'm going to do. In Australia, that doesn't necessarily work that way. You have a little bit more of a UK style of relationship with your third party service provider, more along the lines of a notary, let's say, not a notary as we know it in the US, but
correct. The first thing I can say is, unlike America, we're a very sophisticated company. Anytime we can keep a lawyer out of a transaction, we think that's a good idea. So I have many friends who are lawyers. They say that with great kindness. So in Australia here, depending upon the state regulations, I'm speaking generally because there's a few different terms, the main party to do the exchange, to do the settlement, to finalise the contract is a group of companies we call a conveyancer. And a conveyancer is probably, to put in your terms, a very, very, very junior lawyer. A notary is a good phrase to do it. But all they do is do the conveyancing and the legal requirements to get that contract to settle for that property. That's their full-time job, and that's all they do. So, and that conveyancer is usually one chosen by the purchaser. The vendor does not get involved in that at all. The agent, to step back, the agent in Australia who is a listing agent is representing the vendor. That's what their job is. And regulations ensure that everything we do is in the best interest of the vendor. And that's where our legal responsibility as an agent begins and ends. Then once the purchaser or the buyer brings their contract and their finance to it, their responsibility is to find a conveyancer. We can recommend, but generally we don't. They generally have their own one sorted out. We don't like to get in the recommendation phases because we are representing the vendor. So then they find their conveyancer, and it's their conveyancer's responsibility, or the notaries, to ensure that the contract meets all the requirements of the regulations, including the Foreign Investment Review Board, meets all the requirements of the condition of sale, blah, 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 blah. Then once all that met, it then gets lodged with the state government to say that the transaction is concluded, the financer, the vendor, the purchaser all come together, and that's settled or exchanged at a certain date. So that's the process of how you do that.
So in the United States, we use title companies to research the property history, ensure that there are no encumbrances on the title. That's a function that is being done by the conveyancer? Is that folded into?
It's a function that's confirmed by the conveyancer. In each state, we have a document that has to be prepared by the selling agent or the listing agent, has to be prepared by the vendor, but obviously we do that, on their behalf. And that document has to be true and accurate and correct, size of property, ownership of title, does it meet all state and local council regulations? And that forms the basis of the contract that this property has been prepared, meeting all regulations for a sale. And that's the vendor's responsibility, but we actually take care of that. And then we present that, and our licensing arrangements means we have to have that correct. And then it's the conveyancer on behalf of the purchaser to confirm that's correct and it meets all those requirements. Two distinct transactions.
Okay. And once we're at the stage where we have an accepted offer, like I said, in the United States, the first thing we do is call our attorney. In Australia, who reviews that contract? Do you use a standard form contract, throughout whatever state in Australia you're doing the transaction, or is there a contract that's prepared by the conveyancer? Is it prepared by the real estate agent? How is that process? How does that process work?
So again, each contract is a legal contract prepared by, you have the National Association of REALTORS in each state. We have our institutes in each state. So each state institute is the guardian, if you like, of ensuring that the contracts meet all the state requirements of legislation. And in 99.9% of circumstances, any agent in Australia would use their local state institute standard contract, and that's reviewed every month, every 6 months, every 12 months as necessity changes for what it is. And, I don't know great details, but does it comply with smoke alarm regulations? Does it comply that it's up to date with our local taxes? All those sorts of things. So lawyers in our country have tried to get into that market, to make it cheaper, but not cheaper by thousands, because a standard contract is like $80 or something. So and that's lawyers to try and get in the market, but they would use that standard contract. So an agent or a purchaser from America can have a lot of the surety that that contract meets all state government regulations and meets the industry regulations and is not prepared by, J. Cheever loophole lawyers.
One of the things that we do as part of our due diligence in the United States, especially if there's bank financing, is to get a survey of the property or an updated survey of the property. Is that something that's quite typical in Australia? Is that something that's on file with, your version of the county clerk's office? What is the requirement for getting a survey done, if there is one?
A survey, as you explained it, exists in the contract. There is the assumption, just as I said before, that's a regulatory body, that survey of easements and land size or whatever forms a basis of that contract. And there'd be acceptance in Australia that an external survey would not be required. I mean, people, 40% of purchasers, bring their own builder along, to make sure the walls are solid and all that sort of stuff. But that's more a property inspection rather than a legal inspection. That I want to knock down this wall, or this kitchen has been redone to a standard that suits me or whatever. But that's more a comfort thing for the purchaser rather than a regulatory thing.
And in terms of the property inspection, which is something that, of course, is very, very common here in the United States, and usually we provide, buyers usually take 7 or 10 days to do a property inspection. The contract is contingent on satisfactory inspection. Is there a similar process that's part of the transaction in Australia?
No, it's not a legal requirement. Like I just said, it's a personal requirement. The you have and our phrase is, you have a cooling off period of 1, 2 or 3 days, depending on which state you are, for regulations, to get out of the contract. But once that cooling off period is gone, it becomes an unconditional contract. You are locked into it. But there are clauses that's dependent upon finance, so that goes past the cooling off period. But then if all those conditions of the contract are met, and then after 10 days, you go, oh, we now don't like the kitchen and we now found this, or no, that's your responsibility to do that at that period of time. It's not part of the contract, no.
Okay. And in turn, you mentioned financing. What is the possibility? I know it's usually very difficult, regardless of what country you're going to. If you're going to invest in, any country other than your own, it's always a lot more difficult to get financing for purchase of real estate. What would your recommendations be for a foreign buyer looking to get financing in Australia? How likely is it that they would get it, and what are the basic requirements that a bank would be looking for?
I have to be very conscious here, because in Australia, you have to be a licensed financial planner to give financial advice. So my advice is general and not specific to anybody. So I need it, otherwise someone will find a lawyer. So the situation is, the sourcing finance in America is probably your best option because you have a relationship with your bank there. But having said that, Australian banks, our banking system is arguably the best in the world. We have 4 main banks, and then there's probably up to 100 fringe players. The 4 main banks have been going since Australia started. They are protected by the federal government, and the fringe banks believe that is a disadvantage, but we call it the 4 pillars of our economy. And that was evident during the global financial crisis, which I know most people on the screen today probably don't remember that. Ask your parents about it. It was 10 or 12 years ago now, but during the global financial crisis, none of our banks were under financial pressure. None of our banks were close to collapse, and they actually served our economy very well. So I can't say on occasions they're all well run, because a couple of chief executives, didn't do their full duty or whatever, but that's another story. But in the main, they are very well-run banks, well-resourced, and great confidence to our economy. They have no aversion to lending to foreigners, particularly from the United States. That's just a given in any shape or form. So getting finance here in Australia, because if it's a good property in any suburb or town in Australia, the security is our property. That's based here in Australia. They might have reservations that, you're coming from Billings, Montana, because no one knows where that is. But, so that might be some concern. So it doesn't stop you from getting a loan. But just from transactional point of view, it's a lot easier to source the finance and bring it into Australia. And that's part of the process of the Foreign Investment Review Board.
Okay, and generally from your experience in working with foreign investors, Americans maybe in particular, they might be looking for investment income, real estate investment income, rental properties. What should they know about investing in an Australian property that's going to be used as a rental? Any particular rules or regulations that they need to know? How easy is it to evict a tenant who doesn't pay or who violates the lease? What are some of the tax implications that you might, at least, I know you can't give financial advice, but maybe give some basic guidance to?
Well, it's the, obviously, because I still sit on not in real estate, but outside of, I still sit on a couple of boards in the United States. So I follow American politics and the American economy very, very closely. And you've had your eviction things with tenants there. We've had the same thing during COVID, all those sorts of things. As our government regulators change and become a different environment, the relationship for a tenant in the past 3 or 4 years has been favoured towards those tenants as we've become a more caring society. And that doesn't deter what I'm about to say about how strong the rental market here is in Australia. But again, there's regulations from that. The biggest issue for people looking for rental properties in Australia is to understand the value of home ownership here in Australia. I bought a house in America just before the GFC, and I bought it back and I sold it just before the GFC, only owned it for 18 months. And I bought the same house back post GFC for $1 million less. So next to the same neighbours. So that was a great financial windfall for myself. So timing in Australia is not the issue. Home ownership in Australia is about 75 to 78% of the Australian population own their own home. In America, pre-GFC, it got up to like 38, 40%, but that's probably gone, but you know better than me, but gone back now to 25, 30% or something. So Australians live, breathe and eat to own their own property. The majority of Australians make their wealth through property transactions. The average Australian from Louisville, Kentucky, earning an average wage, loves to buy an investment property and rent it out. It's in our DNA. It's part of what makes us exist. Our economy is only built on two things. We dig things out of the ground and sell it to the world, and we grow food and sell it to the world. And then the third thing is our property. The Australian property market is now worth $9.1 trillion, and it'll be $10 trillion by the end of the year. It's grown by $1.5 trillion during the COVID environment and makes it the biggest industry in Australia. Our retirement industry is only worth $3.3 trillion. Our mining investment industry is only worth $3.1 trillion. The total value of our stock exchange is only worth $2.3 trillion. So when you say our property market's worth $10 trillion, that is the value of property in Australia.
We have a question.
Property prices have never gone down in Australia. So I'm giving the background to give a surety to the people that want to invest here, whatever, to get, before I get to the tenants question. Even during the Great Depression, property prices went up in Australia. Property prices have gone up 20% in the last 12 months here in Australia. The disadvantage is rental vacancies. If I could find an agency in Australia that doesn't have a rental vacancy higher than 0.3%, I don't know where that exists. I was in a small country town 6 months ago when I could travel in between lockdowns, and this was a rental property, $230 a week, very, very modest property in a very modest town. There was 163 people lined up when it opened for inspection. So rental returns, the average rental yield on Australian investment properties at the moment is between 7 and 9%. Regulations make it very difficult for tenants not to pay. There's a whole tribunal process of throwing a tenant out. That's become more restrictive for a landlord in the past 2 or 3 years, as I said earlier, but that's just a process. And the process of, again, in Australia, most real estate agencies, with very few exceptions, are the listing agent, the selling agent, and then they have a division inside that agency that are the rental agents as well. So we're a very closed transaction. So once you choose your right agent down here, he will sell you the property and then his company will rent that property for you. And we like that system, because you can build a relationship with one company, and that makes it very popular. So that desire of the strength of the rental market, even in bad times, our vacancy rate, if it got up to 3%, that would be considered horrible. The standard good time vacancy rate is between 1 and 2.5%. There's always strong demand for rental properties, and that demand is going to increase over the next 2 or 3 years, because like all countries, we need to build another 600,000 houses, apartments around Australia. We're only building about 200, 300,000 at the moment. So there's a land shortage, there's a housing shortage, there's an apartment shortage. COVID times, inner city apartments, there's not a shortage there at the moment, because overseas students are a big part of the Australian economy. 34,000 students haven't returned to Sydney, predominantly from China and India, because our borders have been closed for almost 2 years. 26,000 haven't returned to Melbourne. So that means all those apartments which were built for students have been empty. You can rent them. They've probably got a vacancy rate of 10 or 15%, but that's the pure inner city apartment rates close to universities and colleges. But our borders open in 3 weeks, and the first 50,000 people bring back to the country are students, because our colleges and universities are hemorrhaging. So those rental returns will go up again. So it's just, I know that's a long-winded answer, but for an investment, the Australian rental market, I couldn't think of a better place in the world.
Okay, so we have a few minutes left. I have a few questions also that some of our viewers have asked. So for what you mentioned, capital gains tax during your earlier discussion. If you are an American but you have Australian residency, does the capital gains tax apply?
No, as long as it is your home that you live in.
So it's your primary residence.
You only get one bite of the cherry. So if you own 2 or 3 homes, the other 2 or 3 that are not your primary residence, you pay the capital gains. And that applies to Australians as well. We only get one bite of the cherry at the same time.
Got it. We have another question that, regarding the CIPS, or Certified International Property Specialist. That's a designation through NAR. I'm sure you're familiar with it. And as a CIPS, I mean, we work with clients from all over the world. What is the CIPS network like in Australia? What is their interaction with CIPS agents from other parts of the world? And how do we work with the CIPS in Australia? Is there a network that CIPS in Australia work with here?
It's a growing environment. It's not as strong as it could be. And last year's COVID hasn't helped that. Cindy from NAR head office, who's our liaison officer down here in Australia and New Zealand, is doing a tremendous job of growing that. And I know our National Institutes of R, but again, the agents that see value in that are going through that process, because they deal with a lot of people, particularly from America. But as a association there's 35,000 estate agents in Australia. And with the market being so good as it always is, but so good in the last 2 years, that impetus has not been there, because again, we are selling properties within 24 hours of listing them at the moment. That is the norm. It has been for 2 years or whatever. So it's not as strong as it would be in the United States, but that's not a deterrent for dealing with that, because the regulations of being an accredited agent are virtually the same. We just have to get them to get that international status as well. So it's no cause for alarm is what I'm saying.
Okay. One of the questions is, how are homes financed in Australia? Maybe we could talk a little bit about the down payment. Typically in the United States, banks want to see 20%. Is that pretty much the norm in Australia? Do they expect a higher down payment?
I'll be short of my answer here, because up till about 3 years ago, you could get 100% of financing the property here in Australia. We then had a commission into that, because our property market took off. It took off so small compared to COVID times now. So prices are increasing dramatically. So we have a regulatory body called APRA, which is, they give the requirements to the bank, and the rules have just changed in the last week. So the down payment for an Australian that is trying to get in the market for the first time can be as low as 5%, up to new properties. Not existing built properties. But again, our economy is built upon houses being built. It's a big part of our economy. So the federal government wants more houses built, all those sorts of things. The standard is somewhere between 5 and 20%, depending on whether it's an existing property, your financial situation, or whatever. So it's between 5 and 20%. But it comes back to the financing question. Interest rates here for mortgages are somewhere between 1.2 and 2.5%. 2.5 would be the higher end of the market. People like myself that go back to late 80s and 90s, our interest rates were 18 or 19% there. So when we have millennials talk about how hard it is to buy a house, and we mention 19% interest rate, they just glaze over like it was the Roman Empire or something. So, and those interest rates, as in America, I mean, inflation's out of control in the United States at the moment. I mean, the official rates are sort of 5 or 6%, but it's almost up to 10%. Biggest issue for your economy going forward. And gas prices are going through the roof. I don't need to tell you about that. Inflation here is well covered. So our interest rates will stay at this level for at least another 1 or 2 years around the margins. But what the changes are, and this comes if you're applying for finance here in Australia, when you apply for a loan, the banks now have to calculate your ability to repay that loan at an interest rate of 3 to 5%, not 1 to 2.5%. So you are paying 1 to 2.5%, but your ability to repay the loan is calculated on 3 to 5%. That's how our regulatory bodies move around all those sorts of things. So down payment 5 to 20%, depending on the type of property. Getting finance, they'll calculate an interest rate to 3 to 5%, but you'll pay between 1 and 2.5%.
Great. If anyone else has any questions, please enter in the chat box. One other question: is there a golden visa program in Australia? We see that in many other countries. Is there one in Australia that Americans can take advantage of?
Not really, but you have the opportunity to gain residency from the United States. I need to think of the words you're allowed to use in the political environment these days. I always have to be conscious. It's a lot easier to gain residency, temporary or permanent, if you come from the United States, Great Britain, countries like that. But we have an equal system where everybody can do it. It's just a lot easier to do those sorts of things. So if you were being transferred in a job here, it's like that. You're sponsored by a company. If you decide you want to move to Australia, borrow a house and watch kangaroos go down past your front yard every night, all those sorts of things, there is a process, but you can get a temporary visa and apply for that. And then it's just go through the same as the States, dealing with the governments to get it all approved, all that sort of stuff. But I'm going to say it's a very easy process if you come from America.
Do you find that investment in Australia right now from foreigners is going up or going down at this moment?
It's going up. I mentioned security of tenure before. Our political system, we're a stable government. We speak English. We have great financial institutions. Our economy is booming. We're not called the lucky country for no reason. The unemployment is zero. Our economy is about to open up. We mentioned off camera before, where I live in Melbourne, we're still in full lockdown, have been for 258 days, another 20 days to go, whatever. So our economy is about to explode. Australians, and these are small figures in American terms, but during COVID times, Australians have saved in excess of $230 billion. I myself, I go to the States 3 or 4 times a year. So let's say I spend $50,000 on that. I haven't spent that money. My wife and I haven't been out to any events in the past 12 months, so that saved me $1 billion on new dresses. So we've saved that money. So we're just waiting for the economy to open up. We can go out to dinner, we can go to the movies, we can go to the races. I myself haven't picked up a golf club for 4 months. I've got severe withdrawal problems on that. So the influx of foreigners investing in Australia, I've got to do a play. Yeah, it could not be a better time, because all the indications of our economy, I mean, what we dig out of the ground and sell to China, notwithstanding their political views against America and Australia and Taiwan at the moment, that's a whole other ball game. Iron ore prices are at a record high. We produce clean food. People can't get enough of our watermelons and our bananas or those sorts of things and everything like that. So the only downside to our economic recovery is unemployment. We can't get the right people, because I can't say that Australians are lazy, but with our borders being closed for almost 2 years, the influx of foreign workers to come and pick the fruit and harvest the crops or whatever is down. So it's a wonderful time here at the moment.
So we have one time for one last question. We have just a few more minutes. It's about the reopening of the real estate market in Australia. You touched upon that a little bit. The question is, what's the general mood? I'm going to sort of change that question a little bit. Given all of that pent up demand that you just referred to, that obviously may have an impact on prices, maybe the prices of real estate. You recommend that foreign investors start looking at Australia now or wait until the economy fully reopens?
We're in real estate. It's always a good time to buy. We have to say that. That if you're not saying that, you're not in real estate properly. Two examples. There was a mansion just sold in the suburb I live here in Melbourne. That mansion was sold 18 months ago for $23 million. They've put $5 million of work into it. It takes it to $28 million. It just concluded yesterday for a sale at $43 million. In the normal environment, I saw some figures yesterday, it was this morning now, whatever. There was a house in the Sydney suburb of Epping, which is just a good upper middle class suburb in Australia. The property was on the market 6 months ago for $1.3 million. It sold at auction last night for $1.9 million after 6 months. So we're probably at the end of that sphere of doing things, but we're not at the end of the sphere of it being the same situation, again, because of scarcity. Our biggest problem in the market at the moment, listings are down 43% across the board in Australia, because as you know, people aren't going to sell if they can see nothing to buy. And that's the issue for us. It's a supply of listings. So any good quality listing that comes on at the moment that is priced well, I'm actually sick of seeing on social media 300,000 above reserve, 200,000 above expectations, blah 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 blah. That's the strength of the market. And I get the great work from the NAR database that Cindy everyone sends me, the same sort of thing at the median price or whatever. It's a golden time for real estate.
Great. Mr. Ellis, Ray Ellis, thank you so much for joining us today. We've come to the end. I just want to thank everyone for joining us. Thank you, Ray Ellis, for joining us. Thank you, Cindy Fouth, if you want to say a few words before we sign off. Cindy?
Sure thing. I will just say thank you to the Hudson Gateway Association, to Tony, Emmy, and Kathleen for getting this started and for requesting that we have one of our esteemed speakers from Australia. And Ray, really can't thank you enough for staying up late to talk with us. For those of you who don't know, it is 1 o'clock in the morning. Well, now it's 2 o'clock in the morning, Ray's time. So just want to say thank you. Hope you get out of your lockdown pretty quickly here and get back to America so we can hang out. And thanks to everyone. I hope you all learned something today. And definitely look to the First National Network if you need anything. They're wonderful people. Ray is a very motivational and inspiring leader, in case you didn't catch that. And so thank you to all of you.
And just so everyone knows, this episode is being recorded, so we will be posting it on our website, as we do with all of our global business chats, so that if you ever have to go back and review some of the information that you heard today, you can certainly do that. Ray Ellis, if we can share your contact with anyone who requests it, that would be great as well.
My pleasure, and I'll conclude. I'll say thank you for the opportunity. I have a close affinity with my American friends, all those sorts of things. My wife and I plan to retire in America. That's a secret. Don't share that sort of things, all those sorts of things, because there's a wonderful golf course waiting for me, and she'll be very happy when I retire for me to on the golf course every day and let her do her own thing. But I'll conclude by saying it's been a wonderful opportunity. Thank you for that. Reach out to me anytime, and it's 2 a.m. here now. So if I can't get back to sleep, I can't wait to watch an infomercial on TV about how to lose weight, ride a pentathlon, or buy some useless piece of equipment that's going to change my life, or a dietary system or whatever. So if you can share that pain with me, if I can't go back to sleep, that's what I'm about to go and watch. But thank you everybody very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you everybody.
Just to announce 2 events we're going to have on November 2nd at 10 a.m. We're going to be welcoming Alex Kanan, who is an attorney. I know that some people on this panel here don't like attorneys too much, but Alex is going to give a discussion on how to avoid legal obstacles when working with foreign investments. So please join us on November 2nd at 10 a.m. On December 6th at 10 a.m., we're going to have another global business chat. We're going to be focusing on one of Africa's hottest real estate markets, and that's going to be in the country of Ghana. So please join us on December 6th for that event.
And a tip for Ghana, dress very colourfully. It's part of their DNA. Colour, 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 colour. Don't wear the boring suit and tie. It's all about the colour.
Thank you, thank you. That's a little bit of assistance here. I get or a comment on the way I dressed today, which is very dark.
Thank you, everybody. See you later.
So much.
Thank you.